Hello and good morning from beautiful, kind of chilly fall morning here in the Adirondacks. This week, for our second episode, we're actually going to do something a little bit different. We're starting to release some of our previous episodes on YouTube in video format. We've got everything recorded in video. It's just taking a bit to start doing the necessary editing to get that in a place where we'd want to release it. So, what you've got today, the episode today, is actually our episodes 3 and 4. So our two episodes we did on the propaganda of early fascism, what that looked like. We are combining that into a single YouTube episode. And so this special episode that you're getting here is just the audio combo of those two episodes put into one long form conversation. So our intent for a lot of these in the future is going to be to release the audio versions of these and not split between multiple episodes. That way, if people like to revisit or like to just listen to the deep dive conversations in one go without having to jump across multiple episodes, that's what we're going to be releasing on YouTube in video format. And we are also going to be releasing that audio to subscribers to our podcast. So it's going to be premium content on the podcast, but if you don't want to pay for that, that's totally fine. You can still get access to it via YouTube and see the exact same thing. So it's just one of the ways that we're trying to make sure that any content that we think is important for people to be able to access, they can get freely. But if you want to support the show, you can also subscribe to get access to those audio files if you prefer to just listen to those directly. So this is our first foray into that, and we're releasing this audio track to everybody on the podcast to, one, explain how we're going to be approaching our subscription model and the content that you will get in there. There will be some other content that we'll likely put out in the subscription model that is additional to what we have in the normal show, but we're not going to put anything behind a paywall that we feel is important enough to be provided freely to anyone that would want to access it. So yeah, with that, let's jump into the show.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Propaganda Loves You. I'm Cody Olbert, your host for today's show, and I'm joined by my two co-hosts, Arthur and Joe. Since this is going to be one of our earlier episodes, we want to keep the material kind of light and approachable. So today we're going to talk about fascism, more specifically, propaganda tactics that have been employed by fascist regimes to accomplish their goals. But before we talk about that, if either of you were the dictator of America, what's your slogan, and what false promises are you going to make to the American people?
Oh, wow. There's so much there. I was excited about the hypothetical until you kept going and then insinuated certain things. Like, what kind of false promises are you going to give the American people? I was immediately just thinking, how can I just flip this whole thing upside down and give all the power away and get rid of all the hierarchies in one fell swoop and just be like, I don't know. I don't have a slogan. Yeah, you asked about the slogan and that. Arthur, do you have thoughts? Because I'm just all over the place with this right now.
I think it's something that I fantasize about a lot, but I don't think about the slogan and the promises.
Yeah.
I think keep it simple, like hope,
Yeah.
That's just like for a better future.
That would be solid. Any slogans, Joe? If we took away the requirement that you had to make false promises, what would your slogan be?
Nice.
Anyone who is homeless, you have a home for free. There are plenty of them that are just vacant. They're yours, right? If they won't give you the keys, let us know. We got guys with guns. We'll come over there, make sure they let you in. Everybody has a home. And all doctors are federal employees with good benefits permanently, and just sign up to one of those doctors and start getting your health care, and it's free. And the whole healthcare industry, gone.
I like
You're
it.
gone. No for-profit nonsense in the healthcare, no homelessness. Those would be two good, easy problems to take care of with dictators.
Yeah. Homes are free.
Yeah.
Homes and
We have
healthcare.
life. We're rich enough. We've got enough. We can make it happen for everybody. Live your life. Be happy.
All right. So that was the first one. The second one should be a little bit quicker. This one's called Spot the Fake Slogan. So I'm going to give you guys 5 different slogans, and I'll tell you right off the bat. 2 of them are fake, and then 3 are real. So
What do you
if
mean
can
by
spot the
real?
2 fake ones, like they're actual quotes, actual
From who?
slogans used by
From like
fascist
a
organizations.
dictator person?
Yeah. Yep. All right. So I'll just read them all off, and then you guys can let me know if you're ready to guess. So the first one is believe, obey, fight. The second one is one people, one empire, one ruler. One is tomorrow belongs to us. And number 4 is the strong will rise, the weak will fail. And then the last one is work sets you free.
I really hope that last one is fake.
No, the last one's real. I feel like that's one of the ones I actually recognize.
Yep. You got that one right.
Yeah, very dark. I feel like the only obvious fake I think I spotted is number 4 because the metaphors are mixed. It says the strong will rise and the weak will fail. It should be fall, right? If the metaphor is consistent.
True. And I actually messed that up. It should be fall. Will fall. Yes.
Nailed it. What's the other one?
What about the one ruler? One
Uh,
empire, one people, one ruler.
one people, one empire, one ruler. That is actually true. It's ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. Yeah.
Well, if you had said that.
Right.
Forgot the other 2.
Believe, obey, fight, and the strong will rise, the weak will fall.
Well, that's the fake one.
Okay. Yeah.
Adam.
Yep.
Fake, right?
Sorry. The other one is tomorrow belongs to us.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that one sounds kind of vague enough to... Like, I feel like the fascists are actually kind of specific when they start saying things.
Yeah.
Like,
Yep.
Yeah.
That is the other fake one. That's actually from Cabaret. Back to our main topic for today. So most of this episode is going to focus on historical regimes like Germany, Italy, the more well-known fascist regimes. We'll also talk about Spain a little bit. But, when most people think about fascism, they're probably thinking about military power, secret police, or mass surveillance. But generally, that's not really how fascism starts. Before fascism can rule with an iron fist, it has to win the hearts and minds of the people, or at least enough of the people to put the fascists in power. Fascism isn't just a system of government, it's a belief system, it's a story. And the people who sell that story don't start with fear and violence, they start with hope. They tell you that your country was once great and it's been betrayed, that outsiders and traitors have stolen your future. And most importantly, they tell you only one man or only one movement can restore your honor. They promise jobs, prosperity, and safety. They promise that if you obey and if you trust the leader, everything will be great. Again, to understand how fascism rises, we have to go back to the days before Mussolini, before Hitler, before the world learned the hard way just how deadly these ideas could be. We have to look at how fascists use propaganda to sell a dream and how once that dream takes hold, they're able to translate that into power. So to talk about the rise of fascism, we need to start at the end of World War I. While the end of a war usually starts the beginning of some kind of peace, in the case of World War I, it was the beginning of chaos. The war had shattered empires, bankrupted economies, and left millions dead. Across Europe, nations were unrecognizable from what they had been just 5 years earlier, and in the wreckage, ordinary people were desperate for answers. In Germany, inflation was so extreme by 1923 that a loaf of bread could cost hundreds of billions of marks, and the middle class was basically wiped out overnight. In Italy, war veterans had returned home to find an economy in crisis and a government that was too weak to handle the fallout. And in Spain, political factions were basically on the brink of civil war. Almost every major European country faced the same question, which is like, who's responsible for the situation that we're in? And this is really the moment where fascism thrives, right? It's not in times of strength, but in times of weakness. The first promise of fascism isn't power, it's stability. It tells people that their suffering isn't random, that someone is to blame for this, and that there's only one way to restore order. A newspaper in Italy at this time ran, "Italy needs a strong leader. Mussolini rises." And then that was pretty much what it took in that scenario. In 1919, Mussolini saw his opportunity. Italy was in crisis. There were strikes, riots, and food shortages. The government seemed weak and ineffective, and Mussolini offered a very simple solution. Follow me, and I will make Italy great again. And Mussolini didn't invent fascism overnight. He branded it. He called his movement Fasci de we might just re-record that part. Combattimento. Yeah, I don't know about that one. Anyway,
No, I think
um,
people want to hear you pronounce the Italian words, and like working through
exactly.
it as part of it. You got to say it to the best of your ability, and then we get to
All right.
laugh at how you say it.
All right. That's fair. He called his movement the Fasci de Combattimento. That's what we're going with. All right, perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, the hand gesture, of
Yeah.
course.
I'm basically Gorlami. Okay. This is a reference to ancient Roman fasces, which is like a bundle of rods tied around an axe, which symbolized unity and strength. This is kind of where the word fascism originally came from, right? Mussolini coined that. But unity through what? Strength for whom, right? The details didn't really matter, not yet anyway. What matters was the illusion of power. And Mussolini understood propaganda instinctively. Like, he staged massive spectacles like the Exhibition of Fascist Revolution, which was a propaganda event dramatizing Italy's recent history to cast fascism basically as the nation's savior. His face was everywhere. It was in newspapers, on billboards, in school books. He cultivated the image of a tireless leader, personally overseeing public works, posing shirtless while farming, or standing atop tanks. The press, largely controlled by his allies, pushed the narrative that Italy had found its savior. And across the border in Germany, Adolf Hitler was watching very closely. He saw how Mussolini was able to use fascism as a spectacle, as a movement bigger than just one man, and he wanted to do the same for Germany. Similar to Italy, Germany's defeat in World War I had left the country in ruin. The Treaty of Versailles had humiliated the German people, stripping them of their military and forcing them to pay crushing reparations. As the economy collapsed, Hitler and his newly formed Nazi party began whispering the same words that Mussolini had used. You've been betrayed. You deserve better. Follow me. I will fix this. His speeches weren't just political, they were performances. He modeled his rallies after religious ceremonies, using symbols, flags, and synchronized marches to create a feeling of unity or of destiny. He repeated simple slogans: Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer, one people, one empire, one leader, until they became scripture. For fascism to work, there must always be a villain, right? Mussolini had his communists and anarchists. Hitler took it even further. Jews, socialists, intellectuals, anyone who questioned the movement became an enemy of the people. The propaganda machine went into overdrive, rewriting history in real time to justify basically what was coming next. And in hindsight, it's easy to see fascism for what it was: a violent, oppressive regime built on lies. But at the time, it didn't feel that way to everyone. It felt like hope. It felt like order. It felt like power. The people who supported Mussolini and Hitler in the beginning weren't necessarily all monsters. Many of them just were desperate. They had watched the country collapse, their savings disappear, their future stolen. And when someone came along and said, I can fix this, I can make it great again, it didn't sound like a threat to them. It sounded like salvation. But fascist propaganda doesn't just sell a dream, it also sells an enemy. And once enough people believe in that dream, they're willing to do anything to protect it, even if it means destroying democracy itself. Germany had made its choice, and the world was about to learn what happens when propaganda turns into reality. So one thing I want to note, while Mussolini coined and invented fascism, it didn't mean these tactics weren't used prior to Mussolini. You could go back and look at Napoleon in France and many other imperialist countries or authoritarian regimes prior to Mussolini and identify the same tactics that are being used by fascists. But Mussolini took it one step further in creating an actual political ideology around it. So we are going to talk about this a little bit probably at the end, but I think this is a good point to pause and just ask you guys, based off of the situation that was occurring in Italy and Germany at the time prior to fascism really taking hold, are there any parallels you can think of, anything that you can draw to like current situation and where we are in the world today?
Yeah. I think, in terms of its relatability today, the promise of revival really stood out to me. And also, you said that Mussolini's friends were controlling the media. And I think that that's when fascism really thrives, is when media is under control of the oligarchs. And then, of course, you have the alignment with promise of revival, and that's like exactly what it's happening today.
I was also, when you were talking about Italy and mentioning how Hitler was kind of watching Mussolini for his notes and figuring out what works or what doesn't. In retrospect, I'm not a World War II buff, but I feel like when I think about the so-called bad guys, because I say so-called because the US and Britain did a lot of bad shit in World War II as well, but the bad side, I typically think of Germany and Japan. I don't often think about Italy as much. I think about the Nazis and the Holocaust, and I think about what was going on in the Pacific. Those are like the two main things that I think about. So I just think it's kind of interesting that Mussolini was sort of like the guy that started stirring the pot and got Hitler all curious about how he
Yeah.
could, copy these tactics or whatever. And now, history-wise, we don't really talk about Mussolini as much as we talk about Hitler. So,
Yeah.
yeah. And for precedent, like you said, Mussolini is sort of the start of the word fascism, but we can sort of go back further and look at other examples that, we can retrospectively point out as fascism, even if the concept didn't exist. That's sort of anachronistic, but it's an important thing. And I was thinking, who was the first real, like, American fascist president we've had? And I immediately thought of Andrew Jackson. You know what I mean? Just like how
Yeah.
angrily he went after just the indigenous people in the States and what the culture must have been like around him at the time, right?
Yeah. So like two things, Joe, on the Mussolini comment, because Hitler's like the guy that saw an idea in like Mark Zuckerberg in this scenario to Mussolini's Winklevoss, right? Like those twins. It is interesting. Like we'll talk a little bit about how, despite the fact that Mussolini might have started fascism as we know it, his country was not as prepared as Germany's was for what they were about to go into. The other thing that kind of stuck out to me for this too is something that I don't think I thought about until much more recently in life. And when I go back to thinking about like 2016 as an example and how did Trump get elected the first time, and I think about some of the concerns that were raised about globalization and manufacturing jobs leaving the US, that had no effect on me just because of what I was doing, right? Like, that had no impact on me, but that definitely had a huge impact on a lot of people in the United States, right? They were losing their jobs, losing the ability to work, well, so some of it going overseas, but then also just where did pensions go? Where did financial stability for one person to run their house go, right? Like, after researching this, it almost makes more sense to me,
Mhm.
like how we kind of got to where we are now. But anyway, so we just finished up on post World War One, pre World War II. So now by this time, it's like the mid 1930s. Fascism was no longer a political movement fighting for relevance, but it was the law of the land at this point. Right? Mussolini and Hitler had dismantled their respective democratic institutions, silenced opposition, and turned their nations into one-party states. Their early promises of economic revival and national greatness had actually worked initially. They had won the hearts and minds of millions in their country, and now it was their job to basically keep them. For the fascist regime to survive, it wasn't enough just to control the government, they had to control the reality for their citizens. Mussolini's total takeover of the media, he understood that a dictatorship wasn't just about force, but it was also about belief. People had to believe in the state, in the leader, and the inevitability of victory. But belief didn't happen naturally. It had to be crafted, shaped, and repeated. Mussolini turned the entire Italian media into a propaganda machine. By 1926, Mussolini had bought, intimidated, or banned nearly every independent newspaper in Italy. The few that remained printed only what the government allowed. Schools rewrote history textbooks to portray Mussolini as Italy's savior, and every major film studio, radio station, and theater company received directives on what stories they could tell. Any play or film that didn't glorify Mussolini simply never got made. And at the heart of Mussolini's propaganda machine was the image of the leader. As mentioned before, he was staging photo ops where he's harvesting wheat or building roads or standing shirtless and muscular like a Roman statue brought to life. Um, every public appearance was carefully choreographed to reinforce one message, and that's basically that Mussolini is Italy and Italy is Mussolini. Um, he didn't just control what people saw, but how they saw it.
looking at, the Nazi propaganda machine. And while Mussolini's propaganda emphasized spectacle, Hitler and his minister of propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, uh, is it Goebbels? Goebbels? Both. How do you say it? Goebbels? I know I've heard
I like that
maybe it
last one
was
the best. Goebbels.
Goebbels.
Whichever one is most sinister, say it that way.
Yeah, Goebbels. Okay. Yeah, so Mr. Joseph Goebbels, he took things further, right? He rewrote reality itself. Goebbels didn't just want people to follow the Nazi Party. He wanted them to believe that anything outside of the Nazi Party was treason, right? Newspapers, books, and films that questioned Nazi ideology were banned or burned. History was rewritten to fit the Nazi narrative. Hitler, like Mussolini, was painted as Germany's savior, while Jews, socialists, and intellectuals were demonized as enemies of the state. Goebbels' most dangerous weapon was actually radio. At the time, radio was the most powerful mass communication tool in history. Unlike newspapers or speeches, though, radio didn't require literacy, so anyone could listen, and listen they did. The Nazi government's mass-produced, cheap, government-issued radios, I'm going to try and pronounce it, called Volksempfänger. I think that's actually pretty close. Okay. Which are also known as like the people's receivers. And these were sold at low prices so that every German household could basically buy one and tune in. But the catch was the radios could only pick up state-approved broadcasts. So like super cheap, easy like access method of getting information directly to people, but it's only going to be putting out the information that they want. Every night, families gathered around the radios to hear Hitler's speeches and Goebbels' announcements. It wasn't just a source of information, but it was basically a lifeline directly to the regime. One of the most infamous tactics the Nazis used was the big lie. The idea was simple. So it was basically tell a lie so massive, so audacious that people would just assume it's true. It wasn't enough to claim that Jews were a problem. Nazis declared that Jews were the problem, that they controlled banks, orchestrated Germany's downfall in World War I, and secretly worked to destroy the country from within. It didn't matter that none of that was true. What matters was how many people believed it, and millions of people did. Which really brings us to like a major strategy with fascism, right? Fascism needs enemies, and no fascist regime can survive without that. The promise of fascism, that it's going to bring strength, order, and prosperity, only works if people believe that someone else took those things away from them. Mussolini blamed communists and socialists. Hitler blamed Jews, intellectuals, and liberals. And then Franco of Spain, who was Spain's fascist dictator after the Civil War, blamed leftist Republicans and anarchists. The pattern was the same everywhere fascism took root. Scapegoating served two purposes. One, it gives people a target for their frustrations. If you were struggling to find work or food, it was easier to blame the traitors within than to ask whether the government itself was responsible. Second, it justified state violence. Once a group had been labeled as enemy of the state, any action against them, such as censorship, exile, imprisonment, or even genocide, became a necessity. In Nazi Germany, scapegoating escalated to terrifying levels. Propaganda posters, films, and books dehumanized Jews, portraying them as parasites, criminals, and conspirators. Even children's stories were rewritten to warn against the Jewish threat. Germans were taught from an early age that violence against Jews wasn't just acceptable, it was self-defense. In Italy, Mussolini's scapegoating wasn't as racially motivated, at least not at first. His initial targets were communists and political dissidents, but when Italy aligned itself with Nazi Germany, he embraced Hitler's racial policies, passing anti-Semitic laws in 1938 that stripped Italian Jews of their rights, despite the fact that Jews had lived in Italy for centuries. Franco's Spain followed a different path. Instead of targeting specific ethnic groups, Franco painted his political enemies as existential threats. His propaganda framed the Spanish Civil War as a battle between true Spaniards and red anarchist traitors. Any resistance to his rule was labeled as terrorism. This is what fascist propaganda does. It doesn't just create supporters, it creates fanatics. By 1939, Mussolini and Hitler had reshaped their societies into total propaganda states. Newspapers, films, and schools had all been repurposed into tools of the regime. Alternative viewpoints had been eliminated, and to question the leader was to betray the nation. And yet, for many, fascism still felt like a success. The economy seemed to be improving, national pride had been restored. The streets were orderly, crime was down. It didn't matter that dissenters were being arrested, that books were being burned, and that entire communities were being erased from history. To the average Italian, German, or Spaniard, fascism looked like it was working. But obviously, appearances can be deceiving because even as Mussolini and Hitler held their nations with an iron grip, the larger truth was beginning to unfold. The reality of fascism, specifically the violence, the war, and the totalitarian cruelty, was about to become impossible to ignore. And the world was about to learn that propaganda had its limits. So after World War I, after Hitler and Mussolini took power, obviously the main goal from that point initially was consolidating power internally, right? Silencing dissent internally. This gave them an internal enemy to fight and blame while they took control of their respective countries. So once internal control is established, you still need an enemy to blame and conflict to point to as a proof of strength, which inevitably leads to greater conflict. So all about consolidating power and bringing that to the executive branch. I mean, what was it? The dictator of each of those countries.
Fred, it's slipping out. You can't control it.
Is there a
Like,
parallel there? What do you think about?
I guess like what I think about, well, obviously scapegoating, right? Like that's an easy like to point to. Like who's to blame for everything that's happened recently? I mean, what we're recording this near the end of February. Every plane crash over the last 2 weeks has been DEI related or something like that, right?
What a weak scapegoat, though. Like this DEI thing is just like, as far as fascism goes, classically, such a weak scapegoat. Like Mussolini and Hitler were dealing with people who actually wanted to take power from, like, communists actually want to dismantle the fascists and institute a different kind of government. And ditto with socialists and anarchists or whatever. DEI is just like, hey, people are mean to us a lot, and we'd really like it if we could just like not be, picked on, and we could get jobs and we can like live a normal life without getting made fun of for sexuality or race or whatever. And they're like, in general, pretty calm group of people, the people who benefit from DEI. I mean, statistically, white women are the biggest
Yeah.
beneficiaries of DEI. But that's besides the point. It's just kind of like a weak scapegoat. You're picking on DEI. It's weird. It's weird. It's not a scary boogeyman to point to, you know. I'm just saying it's funny.
Yeah, I think like the immigration being a scapegoat, obviously, like I mean that was since 2016 that we've talked about that. I mean, there's legitimate things you could talk about there. Like we probably do need to work on our immigration policies in the U.S. But that aside, like the DEI piece is interesting to me because like I don't even think they need someone to blame internal to the United States, and I think, like, they just can't say what they want to. And so or at least not yet, like, and so, like, this is
Yeah.
their double speak, right?
Yeah, that's why all their hand gestures are just accidents and spasms for now.
It's just a
Yeah.
stem.
It's pretty funny that they would sell cheap radios and then do state-run media. I'm pretty surprised that they don't do that today, where, like, you can go get a cheap OLED TV and it's all Fox News.
Yeah, that's what you were talking about, the radios, and I immediately was thinking, like, what is there was a phrase you used to describe radio at the time as like the most something form of communication, or there was a phrase that you said that stuck out to me. I remember what it
Yeah.
was.
It was, at the time, radio was the most powerful mass communication tool in history.
Mass communication tool. Yes, the most powerful mass communication tools in history today are what? Not cable news, not newspapers, not legacy media. It's Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, X,
Yeah.
whatever.
Yep.
And just convenient that your buddies happen to own those things.
Yeah.
Just super convenient.
Happened to purchase the largest social media network, 2 years before the election? Just happened to. Accidentally, actually, I think it was
No
like,
goal in mind.
Yeah.
I was really forced into that one.
Well, at least we're not at the point in history yet where it's like the Mussolini movies and it's Trump is like Iron Man in the Marvel movies or something.
The
I
fascist,
mean-
like cringe art is unbearable.
Well, that's what I was gonna mention. I think you were just about to say it too, Joe, but, like, yeah, how many AI pictures of Elon Musk or Trump do you see, like, in Roman like armor or like super jacked with a bald eagle on their shoulder or something like that. Like it was strange to me, like seeing it, but it makes more sense now, right? Like, because they can't actually go out and do those photo shoots, but they can totally write a prompt and get some weird AI art. All right. So we talked through kind of like pre-World War II. At this point, Mussolini and Hitler had really consolidated power for their respective countries. And so like by 1939, the fascist vision of a revived, powerful empire had been sold to millions. Mussolini and Hitler had convinced their people that the future belonged to them, that their nations, once humiliated, would now rise above all others. The propaganda had done its job. The people were loyal. The enemies had been identified. All that remained was the final inevitable step here, which was war. Fascist leaders did not stumble into global conflict. They walked into it willingly, deliberately, and with the full force of their propaganda machines behind them. The entire ideology of fascism was built on expansion, domination, and restoration of a mythic past. To stay in power, Hitler and Mussolini had to deliver on their promises. They had told their people that the world had conspired against them, that treason and weakness had brought their countries to ruin, and that only by striking back could they reclaim their rightful place. The Nazis, having spent years conditioning Germans to believe that war was not only necessary, but righteous, invaded Poland in 1939. German newspapers and radio broadcasts framed the invasion as an act of self-defense. Hitler declared that Germany had been forced into action, that Polish aggression had left them no choice. In reality, the invasion had been planned well in advance, a calculated move to launch the war that fascist propaganda had spent years justifying. As a quick aside, I know this isn't about Germany or the story that we're telling right now, but if you just think about the invasion into Ukraine by Russia, what was like the initial justification? It's, well, this is national security because we can't have a NATO country right on our border, and therefore we're justified in attacking this sovereign country, right? So you can see parallels, and we'll definitely talk more about Russia in the future. So, unlike the Nazis in Germany, Mussolini was not as prepared as they were for war. His carefully curated image of strength masked an uncomfortable truth that Italy, as a country, was not ready for war. The Italian military was underfunded, ill-equipped, and lacking in leadership. But backing down at this point was not an option. Mussolini had promised an empire. He had told the Italian people that they were destined to rule the Mediterranean, that Italy would reclaim the glory of ancient Rome. And so, even as military strategists warned him of disaster, Mussolini led Italy into war. Fascist propaganda made it impossible to admit failure. As Italian troops struggled in North Africa and Greece, Mussolini's newspapers printed headlines declaring victory. Radio broadcasts assured Italians that their soldiers were unstoppable, that their leaders were brilliant tacticians. Even as battlefield defeats mounted, the propaganda machine continued spinning its narrative of triumph. But reality had begun to catch up. In Germany, Hitler faced a similar problem. The early years of the war had gone exactly as his propaganda had promised. Poland had fallen in weeks, France had been conquered in a matter of months, and Hitler's popularity soared. He was a genius, the newspapers declared. The Third Reich was unstoppable, and then came the Eastern Front. The invasion of Soviet Union was basically Hitler's greatest gamble, a military campaign fueled by the same ideological propaganda that brought him into power. Germans had been told that Bolshevism was a disease, that the Slavic peoples were inferior, that victory in the East was inevitable. But as the war dragged on and German troops found themselves outmatched by the vast resources and brutal winners of Russia, even the most loyal Nazis began to see the cracks. Goebbels, ever the master of manipulation, refused to let the public accept the truth. The Reich's newspapers did not report on the catastrophic losses in Stalingrad. Instead, they doubled down on stories of heroism, on tales of German soldiers standing firm against overwhelming odds. Hitler's speeches did not acknowledge the failures of his strategy. Instead, they called for total war, demanding that every German man, woman, and child commit themselves to the fight. But propaganda can only hold back realities for so long. And by 1944, the truth had become undeniable. German cities were being bombed daily. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about like the fall of fascism, basically when the lies stopped working. The promise of fascism has always been power, absolute, unbreakable, and eternal. Mussolini, Hitler, and their followers did not sell fascism as a temporary solution. They promised to rebirth an empire, a future that would stretch beyond generations. The Third Reich was supposed to last 1,000 years. Instead, it collapsed in 12. The end of World War II was not just a military defeat for the fascist regimes, it was a collapse of their propaganda states. For years, Mussolini and Hitler had controlled the press, dictated public perception, and eliminated all dissenting voices. But propaganda only works when people believe it. And in 1945, belief was in short supply. For most of the war, Nazi Germany had maintained a carefully controlled illusion of success. German newspapers did not report on defeats, radio broadcasts did not admit mistakes. Hitler's speeches, even as German cities burned, still promised victory. But propaganda has its limits. By 1944, even the most devoted followers of the Reich could see the truth outside their windows. Germany was losing. The Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944 marked the beginning of the final collapse. As American, British, and Soviet forces pushed into German-occupied territory, the Nazi government doubled down on its deception. Goebbels ordered state media to portray Allied advances as minor setbacks. The German people were told that Hitler had a secret plan, that super weapons were on their way, and that victory was still inevitable. In reality, Hitler had no plan, his armies were in retreat, and his officers that were once loyal to the cause were beginning to realize that their leader had led them into catastrophe. But admitting the truth was impossible. To acknowledge reality was to admit that the Reich had failed and that thousands of speeches, the endless propaganda and mass rallies and war films and slogans, it had all been a lie. This part's just interesting to me because it's the whole sunk cost fallacy of I'm so far deep into this thing that I can't, for some reason, admit that I was wrong because admitting it would say that all these things I've done in the past didn't make any sense. You're still going to be known as the person that did the wrong thing. So I'm just trying to understand the logic behind that, right?
There's a sort of juvenile masculine concept of it's less embarrassing to just pretend you're always right and let the consequences come, but all the while you're just insisting, no, I'm still right, I'm still right. Even when you're in jail, even when you're getting executed, I'm still right, I'm still right. That's less embarrassing than just admitting you were wrong. And which, yeah, it's a weird kind of, I think it has something to do with masculinity, honestly, this whole fascist never admitting defeat kind of thing.
Yeah. Even with, what was it? You saw that before the election, right before, I think it was, Trump went on some news show. I can't remember what it was, but he kind of admitted that he lost in 2020. Said something to the effect of, we were just there. We're so close. And oh my gosh, the neo-Nazis revolted. It was like Nick Fuentes was like, oh my God, you lied to us this whole time. Come on, man. You knew he was lying. What are you talking about? Just craziness. Okay, so Mussolini's collapse came even sooner. By 1943, Italy had suffered catastrophic defeats in North Africa and Greece. The grand vision of a new Roman Empire had crumbled into disarray. Italian cities faced bombing raids, food shortages, and rising anger among the population. Fascism had promised Italy strength and stability, but it had delivered war and starvation. On July 25th, 1943, Mussolini was removed from power by his own government. The fascist Grand Council, sensing that Italy was on the brink of total destruction, turned against him. Mussolini, once the unshakable Deuce, was arrested and imprisoned. Italians who had once chanted his name in the streets now cheered his downfall. It was super interesting to me as I was reading this, but I didn't realize that Mussolini had actually been ousted from power before the war ended by his own government. And I further didn't realize that Hitler decided to go and rescue him. Hitler refused to let it go in September, so a couple months later in 1943, German forces invaded northern Italy and reinstalled Mussolini as a puppet leader of the so-called Italian Social Republic. It was little more than a Nazi-controlled occupation, and Mussolini was now a shell of the dictator he had once been, but remained in power only as long as Hitler allowed it. His own people no longer supported him, his speeches were ignored, and his promises rang hollow. Meanwhile, in Germany, the war was coming home. The Soviet Red Army had pushed into Eastern Europe, crushing German forces as they advanced, and by April 1945, Soviet troops had encircled Berlin. Hitler, hiding in his bunker beneath the city, gave his final speech to the German people. He told them to fight to the last man, never surrender, to believe in the Reich. But outside the bunker, Berlin was in ruins and no one was listening anymore. Mussolini's last days were spent running. With the war all but lost, he attempted to escape to Switzerland, hoping to flee into exile. By April 27th, 1943, he was captured by Italian partisans near the town of Dongo. The next day, he and his mistress, Clara Petacci, were executed by firing squad. Their bodies were taken to Milan, where they were strung up by their ankles in Pizzala Loreto, the very same place where Mussolini's regime had once displayed the bodies of his enemies. It was a brutal, symbolic end to fascist Italy, the leader who had demanded absolute power, now reduced to a broken corpse, reviled by the people that he had once ruled. Hitler, still refusing to surrender, spent his last days in an underground Führer bunker. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet troops advanced through Berlin, he took his own life, shooting himself in the head while his wife, Eva Braun, took cyanide. His body was burned to prevent capture, but the Reich he had built, the world he had envisioned, was already in ashes. So after he tells all the Germans to fight to the last man, he decides to kill himself.
Or did he go to Argentina?
There was a show about this with Robert De Niro, I think. It was on Amazon. But yeah, it had like Hitler still alive in the 80s in Argentina.
Oh, wow.
Running a, yeah, it's a pretty good one.
That's pretty wild that he burned his body.
You were
Yeah.
saying that fight to the last man thing, and then he took his own life or whatever. Have you guys seen Melancholia?
No.
That movie? You haven't? Oh, wow. Yeah, never mind. Might be a moot point, but there's a similar parallel in Melancholia. It's like a end of the world situation. Another planet is actually crashing into planet Earth. And it's like circling around this family. The dad is like reassuring the wife, oh no, he's like a scientific astronomer. He's like, the calculations are perfect. It's just going to slip right by us. It'll be fine. Don't worry, yada, yada, yada. And he found that she had a bunch of pills ready in case, it goes bad. She wanted a way out. And when he realized that do you mind if I spoil the movie? Because I kind of have to spoil the
go
movie.
for it. Crush it.
But like,
Yeah, go.
when he realizes that, the Earth is over, it's about to get crushed, he steals her pills and ODs like he runs away and kills himself and doesn't say anything to her.
Wow.
Just like
They're runners.
Yeah, it's so funny. Another masculinity thing, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So with the deaths of Mussolini and Hitler, their regimes officially ended, but fascist propaganda did not disappear. In the immediate post-war years, many of the same tactics that had been used to maintain fascist rule were repurposed in new ways. In Germany, the process of denazification sought to erase Nazi ideology from public life, but many former Nazi officials remained in positions of influence. The myths of Nazi propaganda that Germany had been betrayed, that fascism had been a noble cause, did not vanish overnight. Some persisted for decades, and you could say it did. In Spain, Franco, who had remained neutral during most of World War II, continued his fascist rule until 1975. Unlike Mussolini and Hitler, Franco did not overextend his ambitions into global war, allowing him to maintain power for decades. His propaganda machine framed him as the protector of Spain, the last great defender against communism. In the decades that followed, fascist rhetoric, the idea that strong leaders must take control, that enemies must be eliminated, and that democracy is weak and fragile, continued to appear in new forms and new places. The war had ended, but the battle over truth, over power, and over manipulation of reality through propaganda was just beginning. So something interesting here that I wanted to talk about for a second, right? We've got Italy and Germany, their leaders both died as part of the war, right? And their fascist governments kind of fell apart. And Franco just continues on until his death in 1975. So it's like the thing that stands out to me is like, if they'd never gone to, global conflict, would their regime have fallen? I don't know. I mean, they look at North Korea or some other like kind of authoritarian fascist regimes that stick to like their own country and oppressing their own people, and how often people actually interfere with that, or other countries would interfere with that if they're not invading another sovereign country. Like, it's just interesting to me.
I don't know.
Yeah.
It's like maybe at the time, was war inevitable? Did they have to join their, allies in the Axis, whatever?
Just thinking about the colonial aspect of fascism and how all this plays out, and it's like, does your question is like, does fascism survive if they don't go to war or whatever? It kind of makes me think that, like, the world in general, we think the world has good people in it trying to do good things. We like to think that there are some good countries with good people in charge of them trying to protect people, but it's really like sort of like a bully in the classroom situation. If he's just picking on this one kid nobody likes and nobody really defends that kid anyway, and the bully doesn't pick on anybody else, they're probably just gonna let that kid get bullied. It's only when the bully starts thinking he can pick on all these other people, he can look around the room and figure out who his next target is, and that's when people are like, we're gonna put a stop to this, right? But if you don't have any sort of colonial ambition as a fascist leader, if you're not trying to expand the empire, then people are perfectly happy to let you brutalize your own people at home. We'll just sit here and watch it. I mean, it's happening now all over the place. You could
Yeah.
do that.
Yeah.
But yeah, until you're a threat to other big egos in the world, nobody's going to mess with you.
Yeah.
But now we have North Korean troops in the Russian-Ukraine thing, right? So that's like, maybe North Korea is not so safe for so long if they keep, jumping in and trying to feel like they can play around in the world a little bit.
Yeah. That was actually the other piece of that was interesting to me too, was just like, it fell after Franco died, like that, the fascist, dictator Spain, or Franconian Spain, because there was no one that could take it on, right? No one that like could fulfill that same role that Franco was filling. But then you brought up North Korea, and you're right, like they've maintained that dictatorship for what, three? I mean, I've at least known or been alive for three, right? Like it was, or maybe not three. I don't know. At least three generations of dictators continuing to run that country. It's just like, if you have it almost set up more like a monarchy where there's some sort of clear line of succession, or like some sort of succession put in place. But most of the guys that are gonna run a fascist country are too narcissistic to ever like name somebody unless it's like direct relative. The question is,
Don't give them ideas. Yeah. You're totally right, though. Monarchies seem to actually, like, I mean, they still exist, and they kind of co-run. They don't really like the head of state. They're more of like the
mascot.
Yeah, they're the mascot for sure.
All right. So we talked about Germany and Italy and a bit of Spain all the way through World War II, but I want to look at post-World War II and kind of like into the current age, just hitting on like, well, what's going on now? There's been a rise in fascist governments or fascist-leaning governments around the world, or if you don't want to say fascist governments because they're not calling themselves fascist, that's fine. There's been a rise in authoritarian governments around the world, and I don't think that's something they would even disagree with, right? The thought of a government being run by like this strong man or a single leader that controls every aspect of that country and is considered, the father of the country, like that's exactly what some of these leaders like Viktor Orban actually want. They want that to be how they're viewed, as the strong man that runs this country. So 1950s, we'll start around there and go to the present day, but the banners of Mussolini and Hitler have obviously been torn down, their statues defaced and their bodies discarded at this point. The world had seen in devastating detail what fascism truly was. It was not the grand empire it had promised, but a landscape of ruin and death. The Nuremberg trials laid bare the crimes of the Nazi leadership. The mass graves of the Holocaust were uncovered, and the Axis nations that had once cheered their leaders now hung their heads in shame. It seemed that fascism had been defeated, not just militarily, but ideologically. The world had learned its lesson, never again. But propaganda does not die so easily, and the methods of Mussolini, Hitler, and Franco had been too effective, too powerful to be buried alongside their regimes. Their tactics, the manipulation of truth, the crafting of enemies, the glorification of authoritarian strength, did not disappear. It evolved. While Germany underwent a process of denazification, removing overt Nazi symbols and ideology from public life, the reality was more complicated. Many of the same businessmen, officials, and military leaders who had supported Hitler remained in positions of power. In the years following the war, the West's focus shifted from fighting fascism to fighting communism. And that was an opportunity. In Spain, Francisco Franco had successfully avoided Hitler and Mussolini's fate. By staying out of World War II, he had ensured his survival. And while the world condemned fascism, Spain remained an openly authoritarian state. Franco ruled until his death in 1975, using many of the same tactics that Hitler and Mussolini had pioneered. His propaganda framed him as the protector of Spain, the only force keeping the nation from falling into communist chaos. Spanish newspapers, school books, and radio broadcasts glorified his rule, erasing opposition from the historical record. Elsewhere in Europe, fascist ideologies found new homes, often rebranded under different names. In Italy, the Movimento Sociale Italiano, founded by former supporters of Mussolini, kept fascist ideals alive, though softened for public acceptance. In Germany, neo-Nazi groups emerged in underground movements, continuing to spread revisionist history and nationalist rhetoric. The world had not rid itself of fascist propaganda, it only forced it into the shadows. If the 1930s and 40s had been dominated by fascist propaganda, the next great battle of ideology was the Cold War. The United States and Soviet Union now controlled the global narrative, each using mass media to wage psychological warfare. In America, anti-communist propaganda took on a distinctly fascist tone. The Red Scare of the 1950s, driven by Senator Joseph McCarthy, mirrored the enemy-building strategies of the Nazis and Italian fascists. Americans were told that communists lurked in the government. Their schools, their neighborhoods, loyalty tests, blacklists, and show trials were common. Just as Hitler had portrayed Jews as infiltrators, McCarthyism framed communists as internal threats working to destroy the nation from within. Hollywood, which had once produced anti-fascist films during World War II, now churned out movies about communist spies and the necessity of American military strength. The idea that democracy was fragile and had to be protected by any means necessary became a common theme in Western media. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was running its own propaganda empire. The USSR portrayed Western democracy as corrupt, decadent, and failing. Soviet newspapers censored negative news about the regime, ensuring that only state-approved narratives reached the public. The Cold War was not just a military standoff, but it was a battle of perception fought with words, images, and controlled narratives. We're definitely going to do an episode at some point on the Red Scare. Like, absolutely. But just if you go and watch Oppenheimer, through the end of it, there's the whole thing. I'm not going to ruin the entire movie of Oppenheimer for anyone that hasn't seen it. But short version, if you're not familiar, of basically the premise of the movie is taking place in different flashbacks and things. But near the end of the movie, it goes into the battle over Oppenheimer's clearance and his ties to communism. He had been running the laboratory that created the nuclear bomb that ended World War II, and all of his ties to, known either collaborators or sympathizers with communism were all known during this time. It was used as a weapon after the war, basically, to remove his influence and power in government. So they silenced anything that he had to say because he had actually come out a little more against, some of the things that the U.S. had done during the war. So can't have scientists now telling people what to think after they create bombs for you, apparently, is the message that was sent there. Anyway, by the late 20th century, the language of fascism had changed, but its methods remained the same. Fascist movements no longer openly called themselves fascist. Instead, they adopted terms like nationalist, patriotic, or populist. But the core messaging remained identical: strong leaders, national purity, and enemy lurking within. The past was better and the future can be great. In the 1990s and early 2000s, far-right movements began gaining traction across Europe and the United States. In Russia, Vladimir Putin consolidated power using state media to erase dissent and promote a glorified image of Russian strength and tradition. In Hungary, Viktor Orban cracked down on independent journalism, portraying himself as the last defender of Europe against globalist elites. And in the United States, nationalist rhetoric took center stage. Right-wing radio hosts and television personalities rebranded fascist talking points as common sense patriotism. Immigrants, minorities, and the media became new scapegoats. Political slogans echoed the propaganda of the past, calls to restore a golden age to defeat traitors within and bring strength back to a weakened nation. And as we look forward, the internet obviously changed everything. Where once propaganda had been controlled by governments and media barons, Now anyone could spread a message. The rise of social media, viral misinformation, and algorithm-driven news feeds created the perfect environment for fascist ideas to spread. In the 2010s, far-right movements embraced memes and viral content as propaganda tools. Online communities like 4chan and Reddit became hubs for nationalist messaging, using humor to normalize extreme ideologies. The rise of disinformation campaigns, often supported by state actors, blurred the lines between reality and fiction. Russian-backed troll farms flooded social media and fake news, conspiracy theories, and nationalist rhetoric. Leaders who embraced these tactics, from Donald Trump to Jair Bolsonaro, relied on social media to bypass traditional media and speak directly to their followers. In the modern era, fascist propaganda no longer needs a ministry of information. It's decentralized, crowdsourced, and global. Some warning signs of fascist propaganda today. It always follows a similar pattern. The only difference is really how it's going to be delivered. When a leader is claiming that the golden age was stolen from a nation, or a specific group is to blame, the free press is the enemy, or only they can fix things, the warning signs are flashing. Fascism has never needed swastikas or black shirts. All it needs is a population that stops questioning, that believes the leader is above the law, and that sees the opposition as treason. So fascism never dies, It retreats and it's adapting. The regimes of Mussolini and Hitler collapse under the weight of their own lies, but their propaganda techniques, the rewriting of history, the manufacturing of enemies, and the glorification of a strong leader survived. Their lessons were studied, repackaged, and used by new leaders in new forms and new technologies. The tools of propaganda that once required government-run newspapers and state-controlled radio stations now fit in a tweet, a meme, a 30-second TikTok video. The control once exerted through censorship and military suppression is now reinforced through algorithm-driven echo chambers and disinformation networks. If the 20th century was a battle for control of the airwaves, the 21st century is a battle for control of attention. And fascism thrives on distraction. It thrives when people believe simple answers to complex problems. It thrives when people are told they are victims and that only one leader, one movement can restore what was lost. It thrives when the press is labeled as the enemy of the people. It thrives when protesters are called terrorists. And it thrives when truth becomes subjective. The promise of fascism has always been the same: a golden past that can be restored, that a great betrayal can be avenged, that a nation's enemies, foreign and domestic, can be eliminated. But the reality of fascism is always the same too. War, economic ruin, and the silencing of all those who dare to question. If history has taught us anything, it's that propaganda is not just a relic of the past. It is a weapon, a system of control, a way to manipulate perception itself. Is it still being used today, right now? This isn't really a question. It's very clear that this is being used today and now. But yeah, the final truth of fascist propaganda is that it only works if people stop asking questions. So what do you guys think? Do you think it was anything that was new to you guys, or was it most of it just kind of a recap?
I like the ending, and I think it really correlates well with Joe's metaphor of it being like a bully in the room, because the people, we can all just go to town on that bully.
Yeah.
We all reject the bully. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I like it.
I felt like a lot of it was new, or for me anyway. Like, I'm not like a World War II buff, so I don't know all the details, especially all the Mussolini stuff. I was just learning a lot listening to that. I thought the little anecdote about how, Mussolini got arrested and taken prisoner and everything, and then Hitler was like, wait a minute, I need my guy in Italy, so went down there to prop him back up. Like, I don't know, I thought that was funny. I never really had known that history, so that was interesting. Yeah, I
was
wonder
the
if
first.
like similar dynamics between people today, Trump, Putin, Bolsonaro, Narendra Modi in India. Like, there are a bunch of little fascist figures on the landscape today, and it'll be kind of terrifying, but in another way also interesting for people like us who are trying to like figure out how all this stuff works and figure out how to question it. What's the most useful way to question it? It'll be interesting to study the social dynamic between all the wannabe fascists today. The people who are trying to cling and hold on to their power. Not only do they kind of need each other rhetorically because they're spreading a similar kind of message, but at the same time, they can't help but compete with one another. They can't help but, it's kind of a measuring contest at a certain point, like who's actually daddy in this situation. I don't know.
Yeah.
That'll be kind of interesting to watch. and scary, obviously, with lots of consequences for lots of people.
Yeah. That's like what's going on right now in Ukraine with this whole back and forth where we're now like negotiating with Russia and keeping Ukraine out of the room. And then we've got this mineral deal that they want to pull with Ukraine, but at the same time, Russia's like, "Oh yeah, we'll do that for you, just with our portion of Ukraine. We'll just end the war, and then you can have all the minerals you want." That's really the realignment is scary. And there was I can't remember who said this. I think it was one of the right-wing pundits or influencers, not Matt Walsh, but one of those guys, like, came out before the election, was like, "I think we need a Viktor Orban style strongman to lead our government." Like, so it's a full acknowledgement of what they are and still saying this is what we need and normalizing that as being the government that they think the United States should have, that we should have a more authoritarian dictatorship-like government and be okay with that, which is just crazy to me.
Like we were mentioning earlier with the sort of desperation in the people that creates the conditions for fascism to thrive. There's a lot of like mental exhaustion that goes along with that with the average person, and you can sort of see it, especially with some of these shows. Like I think the guy from the Daily Show, or one of the guys from the Daily Show, will go to Trump rallies and interview people all the time and just sort of stand in the line and ask them questions and stuff. And you can hear it in some of their responses sometimes when he tries to get them to be specific about Trump's plan. Like I remember leading up to the election, he was asking them, like, what is Trump going to do that's going to make everything better all of a sudden? And this one lady was just like, just trust that he has a plan. Just trust that he has a plan. And there's just this willingness to just give up the analysis because it is messy, it is complicated, it is exhausting to think about. And it's
Yeah.
nice to think that somebody out there is just going to take care of it all, And
Yeah.
that's part of what they depend on too, is people being too just deadbeat exhausted and annoyed and frustrated to even care about analyzing it. The questioning itself becomes a burden for people. You can feel it like emotionally in a lot of.
Yeah. And you just want it to be true.
Yeah.
Sure. I'm sure everyone just really wanted cheaper prices, like to control inflation, to be able to provide for their family and live their life, right? Like, I feel like that's the majority of people.
Hey, thanks for listening and watching today. If this was on YouTube, first YouTube episode, more to come. If you do like the show, there's a couple things that you could do to support us. One, obviously subscribing to the show, leaving reviews, and sharing the show with your friends and family is the biggest way to get the message spread. Also, you can visit our website, www.propagandalovesyou.com. We have actually put up some free posters that you can print out. They've got QR codes to the website. If you want to support the show in a way other than just sharing, you could print out one of these posters, hang it up at your local coffee shop if they let you, or on a street side or local town board, whatever it is that you've got available to you and you feel comfortable doing. That's just another way that you could support the show and spread the message and get more people listening. So thanks again for listening. Stay aware, stay safe, and remember that propaganda loves you.